Today on the Everything 80s podcast, Knight Rider.
Knight Rider, a shadowy flight into the dangerous world of a man who does not exist. Crusade to champion the cause of the innocent, the helpless, the powerless, in a world of criminals who operate above the law.
Hey guys, what's happening? Welcome back to the Everything 80s podcast. I'm Jamie, and this is going to be your one-stop shop for anything and everything you ever wanted to know about Knight Rider. So we'll get right into it. That usual disclaimer, if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to this podcast wherever you find your podcast. Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, iHeartRadio. I'm on all those good places. Okay, let's get right to this. Over the years, there have been some pretty iconic cars featured on TV, from the Batmobile to the General Lee, but there was one that maybe stood out as being, the sweetest ride of them all. And we're looking at the show Knight Rider and, of course, K.I.T.T, the car. And as a quick summary, Knight Rider was a TV series that aired on NBC from 1982 to 1986. It starred David Hasselhoff as Michael Knight and featured K.I.T.T, which was an artificially intelligent and self-aware customized 1982 Pontiac Trans Am. So I owned a Pontiac 1990 Firebird, and I can tell you that was nothing like K.I.T.T. It was my first car. It had synthetic red vinyl for the interior and handled kind of like a shopping cart. This Pontiac was a far cry from the glory of the Trans Am from 1982. So for myself, Knight Rider remains one of my favorite shows ever and an iconic part of the 1980s. I was still a touch too young to be the target audience at first, but when it comes to kids and cars, K.I.T.T may be the greatest of all time. It looked amazing. It could talk. And this is going to look back on the interesting background in the show's development and, everything from the iconic theme song to the production to how K.I.T.T was put together and how David Hasselhoff is involved. We'll get into all that. So the series itself was created and developed by Glenn A. Larson to be aired on NBC. And it was the last show he would produce for Universal Television before moving to Fox. Larson had been involved in some other standout shows and movies, including Battlestar Galactica, Magnum P.I., Buck Rogers in the 25th Century, The Fall Guy, The $6 Million Man. There had been the idea that he only created small screen versions of big movie blockbusters, but he still made a lot of iconic TV series and shows over the years. He also may have, borrowed the idea of Knight Rider from some previous shows, but still created something, compelling and engaging. One intent with Knight Rider was that Larson wanted to recreate the Lone Ranger, but with a car. The Lone Ranger, of course, would ride across the countryside trying to prevent crimes, and he had his trusty steed named Silver. This would be a modern retelling of this classic narrative, as the hero would fight crime, but travel in his car that can assist him. Knight Rider would follow a classic good guy versus bad guy formula, but Larson would still incorporate aspects of some other films to create the structure of the show. K.I.T.T would partly be based on HAL from 2001: A Space Odyssey, and the red LED display on the front was from the scanner lights used by the Cylons from Battlestar Galactica. So looking at how K.I.T.T, the actual car, was created, to make Knight Rider memorable, they needed a pretty amazing car, as it would basically be the supporting character on the show. K.I.T.T, of course, stands for Knight Industries 2000, and this was based on the fictional creator of K.I.T.T named Wilton Knight. Originally, K.I.T.T was going to be called TATT, T-A-T-T, which stood for Trans Am 2000. Honestly, not a bad name, but, obviously K.I.T.T worked well and it stuck. K.I.T.T took a lot of development, and for the first 2 seasons was based on that F-bodied Pontiac Trans Am, but obviously had some alterations to it. The Universal prop department changed some of the look of KITT by adding in that LED display on the front, but early on they didn't do a ton of alterations that kept it, pretty much its normal Trans Am self. Pontiac apparently wasn't on board with this and didn't want any reference to the car being a Trans Am. There's mention that the original KITT made in 1982 cost $100,000 to make, but there are variations on if that was true or not. They would need multiple kits on the show, and they would have 4 of them initially, and each car would cost around $18,000 to modify. I'll get more into that in a second, but if you go to robertwebb.com, so Robert and then WEBB.com, he was one of the production designers and developers of KITT, and on his website you can see all the evolution of KITT, how he was produced, made, everything like that. So since KITT was a supporting character, he needed a voice. The way we think of KITT was never the original intention, but it was developed and kind of evolved thanks to voice actor William Daniels, who of course we know as Mr. Feeney from Boy Meets World. The original intent was that the voice of KITT would be straight up robotic and a very synthesized sounding voice. That made total sense, as it seemed like the obvious way a machine would communicate with people. Daniels thought that KITT should have more of a personality and have a brighter and more amusing voice to it. The early seasons and shows have a bit more of that robotic tone, but nothing like they originally intended. This allowed for some personality to develop, which Daniels had been slowly incorporating into his performance. Eventually, this fully opened up, and Daniels could be more expressful and charming as he brought more character and life to KITT. Some interesting situations arose with the whole process of Daniels doing the voice for KITT. He was never credited as providing the voice throughout the run of the entire series. They apparently had the genuine idea that they wanted people to actually believe that this was a machine and it was a machine-created voice just for this car. No one really knew of Daniels yet, but after a while, everyone realized who he was and that there was a genuine person behind the voice of KITT. Another interesting thing is that Daniels and David Hasselhoff never even got to meet face-to-face till their Christmas party of that first year. Daniels could roll in, record all his dialogue in less than an hour, and then bounce. He would just get a script that had the lines of KITT, would read out the lines that would be spoken by Hasselhoff himself, and then answer them back as KITT, and then that's how they would record it all. So we heard the amazing, iconic theme song from Knight Rider, and to a kid in the 80s, this is probably the coolest TV theme you can remember. But it's an interesting story because it's not entirely an original theme. The Knight Rider theme was composed by Stu Phillips, who also did the music for Battlestar Galactica, The Amazing Spider-Man Show, and The $6 Million Man. And he also made some 50s classics such as Johnny Angel. Phillips would use an 18th century piece of music from the ballet called Sylvia. The original piece was composed by Leo Delibes and was called Cortège de Bacchus. He took this piece as a basis for the Knight Rider theme, but then would give it an 80s twist and more of a synthetic effect. Here's actually some of the clips from that original piece of music, and you can hear the influence in it. So Phillips dug deep on that one and probably assumed that no one would ever probably be able to identify that song or that it's such an old classical piece. But in this day and age, you can find all these sort of things on YouTube. So just interesting to hear where that originally came from. That the Knight Rider theme has been used in some super lackluster songs over the years, specifically thinking of that one by Busta Rhymes and Lil' Kim. And, it's been easily butchered, but still included in funny things like the ringtone in the movie Ted, however. So here's some of the production and how it was shooting scenes with KITT. Since in the context of the show, KITT was a self-driving car, this would take a lot of work from a production standpoint. So George Barris was in charge of everything to do with kit. He was also the guy who brought us the original Adam West Batmobile along with the Munster coach. They made it look like KITT was driving itself. And to do that, Barris had to create a driving position that was on the right side of the car, but was lowered down below the dashboard. The stunt driver would then have to get in on the passenger side and sat on a special seat that would not be picked up by cameras. Barris then had to help orchestrate the driving scenes along with the filming to make sure that the driver would never be detected. The driver still needed to see where he was going, so this is where the editing of Knight Rider played a pivotal part of the show. Barris would design 16 various versions of KITT that would be used during specific shots, and he would also start making some big upgrades by the time the third season rolled around. He added some spoilers, wings, and a new hood scoop along with some other functional additions. There were also versions of the car that had a rubber-like coating shell so that bullets could bounce off it. Again, if you want to see more full detail and pictures of all the new designs, go to that robertwebb.com and you can see he was the artist who helped design it. The new versions of KITT would take around 8 weeks to create, and he would also spend time working on Car, if you remember Car, K-A-R-R. There's nothing more specifically burned in my brain than when Car came on the scene in Knight Rider. Car would essentially be the evil twin of KITT, and it stood for Knight Automated Roving Robot. Every good hero needs an adversary, and Car would be that adversary. And to make it another iconic moment in 80s TV, the voice of Car would be none other than Optimus Prime himself, Peter Cullen. So in case you are unfamiliar with the show or it's been a long time, here's a refresher on the basic plot synopsis of the show. Wilton Knight, who we mentioned before, was a self-made billionaire who one day rescues a detective named Michael Arthur Long. Long had been shot in the face, and he helps to fix him up with plastic surgery along with giving him a new name, Michael Knight. Wilton chooses Michael to be his primary field agent in a new organization he has developed called FLAG. They love the acronyms on Knight Rider. FLAG stood for Foundation for Law and Government, and was designed as a public, just organization, sort of a vigilante type situation, but one that had a lot more leather. The other half of this program involved KITT, who not only had artificial intelligence and was controlled by a computer, but had a very durable and resistance frame and body, so good for battle situations and armored up. So the idea is that they would team up KITT and Michael, and they would be able to dive into any action-based scenario where they had to take matters into their own hands. FLAG was run by Devin Miles, who would always give the assignments out to Michael. There was also Dr. Bonnie Barstow, who was the technical assistant to Miles and the chief engineer for KITT. So there's a lot of James Bond to this now that you might be noticing. So here's who rounds out this whole cast and some other notable things they've appeared in. So Wilton Knight was played by Richard Basehart. He was in The Island of Dr. Moreau. He appeared on Little House on the Prairie. Devin Miles was played by Edward Mulhare. He was in The Adventures of Robin Hood. He appeared in Baywatch Nights. I'm trying to reference more 80s and ish sort of base things. Dr. Bonnie Barstow was played by Patricia McPherson. She was on Matlock, Dynasty, MacGyver. April Curtis was played by Rebecca Holden. She would take the place of Bonnie Barstow after McPherson left after the first season, but would come back in the third season. And Holden appeared on The Love Boat, Three's Company, Magnum P.I. RC3 was played by Peter Peros, who had been on shows like Charles in Charge, Hanging with Mr. Cooper, and he was also a cop on an episode of Seinfeld. So here's the release and the success of Knight Rider and how that came together. So Knight Rider would debut on September 26, 1982, and would run until April 4th, 1986. Knight Rider would find a good audience, which was very difficult going into the mid-80s. This is a time that featured some of the most beloved and iconic and highest rated shows in the history of television. It would usually finish in the top 30 with ratings averaging around 14.4 million viewers, which today would make it the number one show by far. But this was a tough time for TV. If you think how there were really only 3 networks, VCRs weren't even totally common yet. Obviously, no internet, no streaming services, no other ways to entertain people. Everything was watched live, and you could only watch a few shows over the course of a night. Not surprisingly, Knight Rider was a hit with kids and would end up being more successful than a majority of the shows out there because of one thing, and that was merchandising. I had, maybe you had too, I had a Knight Rider lunchbox and a thermos, and like you wouldn't see shows like the Golden Girls branding themselves in that way. So they had a bigger opportunity with this show. Toy cars would obviously be a huge seller, along with things like t-shirts and all other sorts of toys related to the show. Glenn Larson had a lot of foresight and saw that he had a good product on his hands that would create a lot of appeal to kids. He was able to negotiate to get a huge percentage of the merchandising rights, as that was still not a big thing at the time, especially for a TV show. So this is 1982, and a lot of big toys such as, G.I. Joe, Transformers, He-Man haven't come out yet. Star Wars had been a huge success toy-wise, but the idea of merchandising a TV show was pretty much a brand new idea. Universal definitely didn't know how profitable merchandising was and agreed to a 50-50 split on profits with Larson for all the products sold. This is an insane deal that would never happen now, but one that he had the ability to foresee. So here's looking at the future of Knight Rider. And Knight Rider definitely did not, go away quietly. It would reappear in various forms over the years. So here are some of the different iterations of Knight Rider we have seen. So you might remember these, or some you've probably never heard of. So there was Knight Rider 2000. This was a made-for-TV movie from 1991 that was based on the original series, so it can be considered, canon and part of the original. Knight Rider 2010 came out in 1994, and I have no recollection of this. It was another made-for-TV movie, and it was loosely based on the original series. Then there was Team Knight Rider. This ran for one season from 1997 to 1998, and it's about a new team that resemble Flag, and it did very, very poorly. Then there's just straight up Knight Rider. This was a 2008 made-for-TV movie that was created as a way to introduce a new Knight Rider series. So they were using it as what they call a backdoor pilot, where they put this thing out to get an idea if they can launch this thing into a full-fledged series if there was enough interest. In this case, Kit becomes a Ford Mustang Shelby GT 500 KR and is voiced by Val Kilmer. It has more connections to the original Knight Rider. It features the estranged son of Michael Knight, and it ignores everything from that Knight Rider 2010 and Team Knight Rider show. It had pretty good ratings, but was pretty destroyed by critics. They released the Knight Rider weekly series, intending for at least a 2-year run, but it was canceled after just 17 episodes. And I blame Val Kilmer for that. But again, this is something I remember vaguely coming up, but just thinking it was going to be kind of hokey and it wouldn't capture the spirit of the original. So, I maybe watched like a few minutes, but not enough that it was engaging. And it did, the fact that it lasted 17 episodes is pretty significant. So I don't know, maybe you remember that a bit better and actually liked it or found something more enjoyable from it. Okay, start wrapping it up here. That's the basic story of Knight Rider, and in my opinion, the coolest car ever created. I think it made for the perfect TV series of the 80s as it combined technology and drama. It had a bit of a Blade Runner feel to me, even though if I went back and rewatched old series, I'm sure it wouldn't hold up as well as it did when I was 8 years old. I found a few episodes on YouTube, and it's slower paced than I remember, but again, like they had time to develop these shows and they were allowed to like explore characters and themes, and they didn't have to rush out like when a new series was released on, whether it's on TV or Netflix, they got to cram it full of everything possible because it's so hard to get an audience with so many things vying for people's attention. So, you see shows that only do 2 or 3 seasons, and they'll maybe do 10 or 12 episodes per season, and they've just got to cram everything right in. But with, these shows in the early 80s, they were allowed to let the drama play it a little bit more and let you get a little bit more invested and stuff like that. So, like I said, it maybe is a bit slower paced than what you came to expect or that you remember, but it still has a lot of that action and a lot of that like cinematic sort of movie scope to it, which I think made it really compelling. But, for any kid in the 80s, Knight Rider was a huge part of it, whether it's just for the love of the show or for all the merchandising that came from it, and having, the Knight Rider lunchbox and having the toy car and bed sheets or whatever it was. It was sort of that kickoff of launching into these other huge properties that everyone would come to embrace in the 80s, like, G.I. Joe, Transformers, everything like that. But this was like our real life version of all those things. So thanks for checking this show out. Hopefully you learned some new things about a show that you really enjoyed in the 80s, or, just remembering it in general. And again, like, if you really like this show, make sure you subscribe to it so it's automatically sent to you, all that good stuff. Again, wherever you find your podcast, I should be there. Thanks again for taking the time. I know there's a ton of podcasts out there now. So just, the fact you've stopped by to check this one out means a lot. Okay, thanks for listening. I'll see you later.